Welcome to Real, Brave, and Unstoppable. Here, you'll hear stories and inspiration about showing up in the world authentically and having the courage to create the life you want. I'm your host, Courtney Rivard. I'm a mom, recovering engineer, lover of the outdoors, and professional life coach. I help smart women just like you live happier lives full of purpose and joy by empowering them to love who they are, get unstuck, and take action toward creating the life they dream of. In other words, I help them be real, brave, and unstoppable. It is possible, and you can do it too. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome, friends, to episode 116 of Real, Brave, and Unstoppable on living in the quote-unquote messy middle, or navigating the gap between the way things are and the way you want things to be. I was coaching a client last week who recently got back together with her partner after some time apart, and she's got a lot of feelings of betrayal and hurt. Also has a hard time trusting that her partner will really show up for her in the way that she needs and wants him to. I coach a lot of people on this kind of thing. The should I stay or should I go question. It's really a difficult thing to coach people through because they tend to want to set a goal around making a decision, but making these types of decisions is really hard and uncomfortable. And what tends to happen is that being in indecision in a relationship usually means that one person has like a back door. In case things get rough, there's an exit. So we talked through this back door or like safety valve, and she mentioned that she starts to go there when there's a problem in the relationship. So having a back door is like a way of avoiding the discomfort that comes with a problem. Now, caveat, I'm not talking about abusive relationships or relationships that have really truly run their course and things just aren't solvable any longer. I'm just talking about, normal conflict. When things get sticky, our brain is like, no, get out. This doesn't feel good. You're supposed to feel good. And flipping between I'm in and I'm out creates this like distance in a relationship. And so learning how to live in this like messy middle of feeling uncomfortable can feel really hard. And by the way, this episode is not solely on relationships. This can apply to anything, and we'll talk about some other examples in just a minute. So what is this messy middle? Or sometimes I'll refer to it as the gap. But the messy middle is the space between the way things are, like reality, and the way you want things to be. So our human tendency is to be doing whatever we need to do to close that gap. So, we feel discomfort when things aren't the way we want them to be. So there's discomfort on one end of it, and we'd rather not feel that. So we do what we need to do to get rid of the discomfort. It's kind of like we want to just give up all the patience and skip the journey from one end of the gap to the other. We just want to arrive. I mean, let's face it, feeling uncomfortable, whether that shows up as an uncomfortable emotion or just physically feels uncomfortable, like that kind of sucks, right? So, no one wants to feel crappy or uncomfortable, and it's natural to want to avoid that feeling rather than lean into it. Not being where we want to be is what creates that uncomfortable feeling. I quote this a lot on the show, but author Pema Chodron says that the reason we suffer is because we cling to the way we want things to be or the way we think things should be. When we're attached to that outcome and we don't get it, we feel bad. Maybe bad is kind of a umbrella emotion. It's one of the ones we go to, but what is, bad can be sad. We might feel inadequate, resentful, frustrated, and so on. By the way, it's really helpful there's a website called feelingswheel.com. Like a wheel, like on a car, feelingswheel.com. It has a feelings wheel that has like the major emotions in the middle and then different, like it just kind of nuanced emotions as you go farther and farther out the wheel. It's super helpful. I highly recommend if you want to dive into some of this work, it can be really helpful just to know some of the more nuanced emotions instead of just bad, sad, mad. Anyway, so when we feel those uncomfortable emotions or unwanted emotions, a lot of times we hook into them because we judge them as bad. I don't want to feel this. And pretty soon they're starting to run the show. They dictate our behavior or how we show up to life. And I'm going to give you some more examples of this gap. I use the relationship gap above as an example, but other examples could be, let's say you interviewed for a job and you're waiting to hear about it. So you experience anxiety or worry, maybe stress over not knowing. So that messy middle is the space between not knowing and wanting to know, right? So once you know, the feeling of anxiety or whatever goes away. And if you don't get the job, then it's just a new, different messy middle. Intense conversations where two people don't agree, the messy middle is between your opinion and wanting someone to agree with you. The tension that comes with having something unresolved is uncomfortable for most people. Related to health, wanting to lose weight could be an example. Like if you don't like your body, you feel really sluggish, low energy, and want to be in better shape. Like what you see in the mirror, have more energy, be happy with your fitness level. The messy middle is the discomfort that you feel when you wish you were different. I think that's a really good example because it illustrates like how accepting yourself on that journey is so important. And that's kind of what this all is. It's like accepting that middle. It doesn't mean it won't change, but you're just accepting what you're working with at the time. There's one more example. I had a client the other day who was experiencing sadness over the realization that she would likely never be a parent. And her messy middle is really the sadness that she feels from the gap is between not having kids and wanting kids. It's that wanting or wishing she could, but knowing she probably won't have them. So the gap or the messy middle is kind of like it's almost like a limbo land, or sometimes I call it a swamp. Also, I have tons of great metaphors or words for this space. But it's kind of like limbo because we're dealing with some uncomfortable stuff that typically we want to get out of. So our brain is alerting us constantly to the fact that we're not where we want to be or where we should be, quote unquote. And then we have all kinds of thoughts about that too. And then that creates more uncomfortable emotions. And we have to be really intentional about this place that doesn't feel good. It's really natural that this messy feeling or uncomfortable gap exists. Our brains, we don't like uncertainty. Interestingly enough, uncertainty is actually a human need, the need for surprise and novelty. Otherwise, life gets stagnant and boring. That's just a side note. But we really like to control how much uncertainty we have in our lives. So when things are uncertain, we get really uncomfortable. So think about it. When you have something to talk to a partner about and you're a little scared to broach that subject because you're not really sure how he or she will react, or you're up for promotion and it's uncertain as to whether or not you'll get it. You just had a disagreement with a friend and you don't know how things are going to end up. Those are all examples of uncomfortable situations that we might find ourselves in. And also anytime we encounter something new in life, like new people, new activities, new environments, we might feel varying degrees of discomfort. It's uncomfortable to get out of your comfort zone. Duh, obviously, right? And I also know that in these moments, this is where the growth happens. You gain confidence that you can navigate that middle space or the gap in spite of the discomfort. You learn to trust your resilience. You learn to dig deep and find resources you didn't realize you had. And go back and listen to episode number 114 about chaos for more on that. Really good episode. So back to this messy middle we're talking about here. What does it look like? What does the gap look like? And how do we navigate this? Well, it can be a short gap or it can be a long gap. Meaning it can be a gap in a moment between feeling an emotion and an emotionally driven reaction. It can look like a long gap where you're having to wait to know what an outcome is going to be. And it can be somewhere in between those two as well. It can look like the emotion that comes up when your partner triggers you. Sitting with that. It can look like feeling ashamed that you acted out at someone. Feeling bad about yourself because you didn't do something perfectly. It can look like feeling unsettled because there's an unresolved issue in a relationship, or overwhelm and worry because you have too much on your to-do list. Sadness because you suffered a loss of some sort. Feeling unimportant in a relationship. Like all of these things are spaces where we just don't feel the way we want to feel. But here's the thing about the messy middle is that no one likes it. Duh. It doesn't feel good. So we kind of tend to make it an enemy. We judge it. We make the feelings we feel in that messy middle the bad guy. And we become all about avoiding that. So what's wrong with that, you ask? Avoiding. There's nothing wrong with it, because sometimes we need a break from a really hard emotion. But what happens over time is that we get in the habit of avoiding whatever that experience is. And in coaching and psychology, we call that experiential avoidance. But when that becomes a habit, it doesn't really serve us over the long term. So, when we do feel an emotion we don't like, so for example, we feel the feelings of frustration or anger come up in a conversation and we might snap. The snap will create a new emotion, but it's helped relieve that initial one. So maybe you feel feelings of shame because you disappointed someone. So to avoid the feeling of shame, you go into people pleasing or fixing. So you're not disappointing that person anymore. Your brain tells you that as long as you fix it, you won't have to feel that awful feeling of shame. Now, the interesting thing is, you can imagine if you go into people-pleasing mode and you're overextending yourself to make sure you just don't disappoint everyone, then you have all kinds of different emotions that come up, that might come with stress or anxiety or something like that. So the thing is, the point, you maybe are catching on to this as I'm talking here, but there's always going to be a hard emotion. Even if you avoid one you don't like, or, if you avoid a situation you don't like, there's always going to be a hard situation. So you might as well learn how to exist in this gap. I have a client that's working on her relationship with her parents, and her mom is a little bit emotionally immature, and my client often gets really annoyed with her. Her avoidance mechanism is to withdraw and create this boundary with her mom, which is fine. However, and healthy. However, after further discussion, we figured out she was really letting her annoyance dictate how she showed up for her mom, which was withdrawing. And it helped her avoid further annoyance, which is sometimes totally appropriate. But the key part of this is that the emotion was actually dictating how she showed up. So when we explored this a little more, we realized that she didn't want to sit with that emotion of annoyance. And if she was able to hold that without judgment, she could decide how she wanted to handle the situation from a more objective standpoint that was in line with her values, like what's important in how she shows up for her mom without letting being annoyed run the show. So it's really important to be able to acknowledge the emotions. Well, first notice them, and then actually just acknowledge them. And we'll talk about that in detail in a minute. But it's also really important to normalize them or neutralize them, because what happens is that we get into judgment of them, labeling them good or bad, and that doesn't help us make space for them. And that's what helps us, that's what pushes us to avoid them. So how do we make space for all of the crap that's in the messy middle? How do we lean into whatever it is that shows up there? Well, this is like so much of this is a practice. It's not always easy, and you will never, ever get it perfect. So the first thing we start with is awareness. I always say awareness is half the battle, and it really is. So why is this messy middle hard? Because we have a judgment that it's hard and negative and unwanted. Well, of course, it's going to suck if we look at it that way, right? So being in this space is really uncomfortable. You're figuring that out as I talk. I'm sure I've said that many times, but the judgment that it's bad creates feelings that feel bad. So let's talk about some strategies for embracing this discomfort, or at least accepting it and leaning into it. So the first is acceptance of the discomfort. You can think of this as acceptance of an entire situation or parts of it that are out of your control, or you can also think of it a little more granularly, like as willingness to make space or willingness to feel an uncomfortable emotion or physical feeling or unhelpful thought even. So let's talk about how to do this. And I'm going to talk about this on a more granular level, like how to accept unwanted emotions, because this is really the foundation or like the building block of accepting bigger things and situations. So one of my favorite ways to stop fighting this messy middle space is something I call the 3 N's. Notice, name, and neutralize or normalize. Notice is simply tuning into the present moment and noticing what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're doing, just what's present. Naming is simply naming the emotion or unhelpful thought. Language is really important here. So listen up. Instead of, for example, saying to yourself, I'm angry, you really want to shift that to like noticing the experience of it. Like, so the language might look like, I'm noticing the feeling of anger, or I notice I'm having some angry feelings, or there's angry, or I'm noticing that I'm feeling angry. Say both ways out loud to yourself. Like, I'm angry versus I'm noticing the feeling of anger. Like, say those out loud to yourself, like take a minute and do it right now. And do you notice the difference? It feels a little less heavy. It's more like a client that I was working on with this the other day said, it seems a little more transient when you say it that way. And I loved how he described that because, yeah, it feels like when you say, I notice anger, it's just like, oh, there's anger. There might be something else coming soon. I don't know. But it feels like it's not like I'm angry. It just feels like, whoa, pretty big, right? So neutralizing, or another way to look at it is normalizing. It's really just creating a really neutral stance from which you see this emotion. It's like acknowledging that it's okay to feel this way. It's validating yourself for having the feeling. Like, it makes sense why I would have this feeling. Of course I feel angry. So-and-so just really hurt me. Like, of course they feel hurt, or of course they feel frustrated. Anyone would feel that way given what's happened. Really validating yourself for having the feeling is just what you're working with right now. No judgment, nothing to fix here. You don't need to fix the emotion. You don't need to go to great lengths to change it. It's going to change on its own. Just let it do its thing. So let's work with an example. My partner and I had a pretty big argument the other day. One of many over the last couple of weeks. So much fun. I was really angry at him, as well as really frustrated at how invalidating he was to me. And I noticed that I was feeling really jittery. Like, there was like the first thing that I like to do is really, when I'm trying to practice this, is really get into my body. Like, I felt like there was a hole in my chest and in my stomach. And then I noticed emotions like anger, frustration, sadness, and even like defeat. So following this framework, I noticed it. I just told you what I noticed. And then naming looks like, I notice anger. I also notice some frustration and sadness, and I notice I'm feeling a sense of defeat. I'm also noticing some physical sensations like a pit in my stomach and a hole in my chest. And I'm also noticing I have a little anxiety, or I'm experiencing a little anxiety. That's what that looks like. And then neutralizing or normalizing might look like, yeah, these emotions are normal. We just had a pretty big argument. I don't agree with the things he said, and he refuses to listen to what I have to say, and he said some pretty mean things to me. So of course I would feel these things, and it's okay to feel that way. Makes sense. And also the goal here, like I said before, is not to judge our experience or to feel the need to fix it or push unwanted emotions away. So if I notice I'm wanting to do that, I might really focus on sticking with the emotions or even the physical part of it, really leaning into them and making a point to feel them, or even the physical sensations I'm experiencing. Not easy to do all the time because it is uncomfortable. And most of us have been taught to avoid what doesn't feel good. I mean, that's pretty normal, right? Yes, totally normal. Another thing that's helpful to think about here is working on adopting more of a growth type mindset. I mentioned that the goal of acceptance is, to accept, not to judge or fix something to avoid feeling crappy or uncomfortable. So remember, our thoughts create our feelings. So it's worth looking at our beautiful brains and what they're contributing to our feelings about being in this messy space. For example, I hate feeling this way, or my life sucks. What might be a more helpful thought? Well, first of all, acknowledge that, what you've got to work with right now isn't ideal. And that's okay. I mean, that's life sometimes. And then a simple shift like, things feel really hard to me right now, and this is temporary. Or another thing that I like to adopt is a mindset of thinking like, what is this trying to teach me? Or what can I learn from this? Instead of, why is this happening to me? Or why is this happening? It's really a great shift to work on. And there's a lot of great stuff you can do there. Also important, like I said, it is important to acknowledge that something's hard though. You don't have to flip to like rainbows and unicorns. It's something can suck, but also you can find a better mindset about it. So I want to really stress here, it's really important to note here that we don't employ these techniques or skills to get rid of the shitty feelings or the uncomfortable stuff. We use these skills to make it more bearable, to let them hang out while they need to hang out. So one way I like to really think about this is, I think it's kind of a good analogy, is let's just pretend that maybe you're going on a trip and you have a ton of stuff to do. You have like cleaning to do, packing to do. You got to line up stuff for your pets, for a pet sitter and all the things. And you got a really early flight, so you got to get it all done. And then some friends that kind of annoy you, they stop in to say hi. It's not that they totally annoy you. It's not that you don't like them, but like you're like, it's really annoying that you just showed up right now because I have so much stuff to do. But you want to be nice. And you're happy to see them too. So you're like, okay, I'm really busy, but come on in anyway. But I'm going to keep doing my stuff and you can hang out while I do my stuff. But just know that I've got lots to do. So it's kind of like that. These emotions that are uncomfortable, they're like hanging out with you and you're just kind of accepting they're there while you keep doing what you need to do to carry on. Like, it's not avoiding them. It's not, it's sort of like, okay, let me make space for you to be here while I make space for myself also to get my shit done. Okay, so another thing that I like to ask myself is, or actually ask my emotions, is there something that my emotions are trying to tell me? Feeling disrespected, for example, might be trying to tell you to look at your boundaries. There might be deeper learnings to discover by exploring your emotions further. This is where, friends, that feelings wheel I told you about earlier, this is where that's so helpful. Because if you can get to a nuanced emotion, like it might really give you some information about like, why am I feeling this way? And it can help you accept that emotion a little easier. Because, for example, let's just say somebody crosses a boundary and, you feel happy about it. Well, that's not super healthy because we need boundaries, right? So think about it that way. Emotions do serve a purpose. If you haven't ever seen the movie Inside Out, by the way, go watch it. Talks about this concept exactly. So sometimes the gap creates, or that messy middle space creates feelings that are really intense. And if some of these skills are new to you, they might be really hard to access because of this. Sometimes our nervous system is just too overloaded to go through this stuff, and that's totally okay and normal. We just need to kind of bring it down, regulate a little bit before this acceptance stuff is accessible. So the modality of DBT, or dialectical behavior therapy, has some really great stuff here to help with like distress tolerance. Surfing the moment, or the TIP skill, TIPP in DBT, are skills that help you ride out the really intense portion of the emotion. Remember, emotions have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And TIP stands for temperature, intense exercise, paced breathing, and paired muscle relaxation. So these are all ways that you can change your physiology, and that can help you ride out that intense part of the emotional wave so you can get back to a place where you actually can employ some of the deeper awareness-based skills that I've talked about. You can Google TIP skills for more info on that. And again, TIP is TIPP. Distraction is also a good technique here. Looking at something pleasant, counting to 5, looking around the room and naming 5 things that are black or white or soft or hard, whatever works for you. Naming an animal for each letter of the alphabet is just some, distraction. Now, one of my clients actually asked me the other day, well, isn't that just avoiding? And I laughed. I was like, that's a very good question. The answer is yes and no. It's not really avoiding it. It's distracting from it until your nervous system can calm down. You're still not trying to push away the emotion, because once you get regulated a little bit, then you can access some of these other skills I talked about. You don't ever want to get to the point where you're just trying to push the emotion away all the time. Because like I said earlier, you're always going to have uncomfortable emotions in life. So, if you push one away, another unwanted one's going to come anyway. So like you want to learn how to do this stuff. So those are some of the more tactical skills to help you like regulate before you get into some of the more awareness type skills like, mindset, thinking, thoughts, and then just acceptance of emotions. So another aspect of being in this messy middle space is having support. This is so important. Friends, family, a coach or therapist, accountability partners, mentors, having some sort of support network is essential. Sometimes I talk to people, and sometimes I feel like this too, honestly, and they say that they have a hard time making close friends. And I totally get it. So try things like engaging in meetup groups or something like that for hobbies that you enjoy. Really get creative. And obviously, going to a meetup group isn't going to just score you a bunch of really close friendships, but it does help you, being social and being with other people can be super helpful, just connecting. And then who knows what kind of friendships that, and relationships you'll make through that. So, as I mentioned before, we can think about the messy middle as, just sitting with these hard emotions that come in there, in that messy gap. And, I call it the messy middle because it's uncomfortable. There's all kinds of uncomfortable stuff in there. And so when we navigate it, sometimes, at least for me anyway, it can tend to be really messy, not pretty. So, we can also think about it, like I said earlier, like as broadly as a situation or a period of time. So, which includes all of the uncomfortable emotions. So I'm going to share my own personal example about one of my messy middles, and know that these periods are totally, totally normal in life. They're like seasons, like we all go through them. So when I was going through my divorce, it's funny, it's been so long now. It seems kind of like an eternity ago, but also not that long at all. It was 9 years ago that I discovered my ex-husband was having an affair with a guy. And 9 years, crazy. So my messy middle lasted several years. It was a tough time, long, messy middle. So I had a really hard time accepting how uncomfortable that was. And at the time, I didn't know any of this stuff, so it made it a lot harder for me. But some of the things that I learned along the way were really important to, learning how to navigate my other gaps or messy middles, right? Like when I was, there's so many sub messy middles in there too. When I made the discovery, I just was so dysregulated. I had so many hard emotions. And, I gradually learned when I felt those through, I mentioned dialectical behavior therapy. That was so helpful for me to just tolerate those emotions, to be able to step back and, a lot of the tip skills I talked about, or even distraction techniques, self-soothing, those were super important for me to be able to handle those emotions that I just wasn't equipped to be with. It helped me regulate a little bit. And that just in and of itself took me a lot of practice to get to be able to do that. And some of the thought work too, that was stuff that really was helpful for me. It took a while to really learn how to employ that. But, and then also just to point out the acceptance of those emotions, that's really the first part of it. Emotions, when they're really out of control, can be really scary. But the way that I'll just kind of share some things about how I got through it. First of all, I did a lot of falling on my face. And that's okay, right? You learn from that. So at the time, it felt really awful, but I learned a lot from it. So there's that. Life lessons through failing and screwing up. So also one of the things that stuck with me and was super helpful for me was learning that my thoughts are not facts. And the first book I ever read that taught me that was The Untethered Soul by Michael A. Singer. So that was one thing that helped me just really embrace that, when I was having a thought that was telling me my life was over and things were, never going to get better, I could recognize, that's just that story that my brain is playing, that narrative, that tape that my brain is playing for me. And that doesn't not necessarily true. And actually, when I stopped to really look at those thoughts, it's probably not true, right? So just chipping away at that, working on that was another thing. And then, just self-soothing skills, learning how to handle, be with an emotion, how to accept an emotion, ways to regulate my nervous system. And finally, once you learn those skills, I think zooming out a little bit and knowing that, hey, we have these seasons in life that sometimes they just really suck and they're not going to last forever. And, it's looking at, where am I really hanging on to something that's not serving me anymore? Where do I need to do a little bit of letting go? And the other thing that really helped me too was thinking about, there's a quote, I don't know where it came from, but the only way is through is totally the most truthful thing ever. The only way is through. There's no debating that. When you're going through a hard time, the only way is to just go through it. There's no shortcut. And every time you try to take a shortcut, you're going to realize that the shortcut's a dead end. You're just going to have to go back to the path anyway. So might as well just walk through it. So really knowing that and just what's important to me, know your values, take one step at a time, one foot in front of the other. Sometimes you'll feel super overwhelmed with your messy middle. And that's when you stop and say, what's important to me here? What direction, where's my values? That's my compass. What direction do I need to be heading? And what's a baby step I can take here to get me unstuck? And that's super important. And one more thing that is so important, and none of us do this enough, but self-compassion. Learn to be nice to yourself. Learn to love on yourself when you're going through these hard times. Really learn to do that. It's so important. And so what's the outcome of embracing all of this discomfort? It's not things are, perfect. No, it's just that when I go through another time of feeling really uncomfortable, I have the tools to be able to navigate that a little more gracefully. It doesn't ever mean it feels good or I like it. It just means that I'm a little more of an expert, or I'm a little more, seasoned in terms of getting through that. So, one thing with all of this is that it's sort of all about embracing what gets thrown at you too. I mentioned letting go just a minute ago. And I think that's a big part of this. It's a journey. It sounds cheesy and cliche, but this is a journey. Embrace it. Find the meaning in it. Even the tough parts. Where can you find meaning in those tough parts? And really, really, really important is to acknowledge the growth that you're having and celebrate your victories, no matter how big or how small. Celebrate your progress. Don't sell yourself short. These messy middles, this is where we're totally out of our comfort zone. And this is where the growth happens. This is where we become stronger. We become more resilient. We really learn more about ourselves and really become we're just always constantly becoming the people we're meant to be. But this is where we take those big steps. It's where we really find out what we're made out of. And honestly, these tough times do bring meaning to life, because without them, we wouldn't know how to appreciate the times that are positive and good and beautiful and feel good. So I'm going to leave you with something to think about. Think about your life and just kind of see where you are experiencing a messy middle. Whether it's just simply you're waiting to hear if you got a job or not and you feel anxious about it, or you have something unresolved with someone and you're sitting there not knowing how it's going to end, and that doesn't feel good. Or I gave the example of my divorce, that messy middle. Maybe you have something just entirely huge, or it just feels like a shit show in there. Just think about what messy middles you have in your life and think about how you can apply some of these, these skills to your own experience. And I would love to hear if this was helpful. Shoot me an email, Courtney@CourtneyRivard.com. If you have any feedback about it, I'd love to hear what worked for you, what didn't work for you. That's always really helpful for me. And one more thing before I go, if you are enjoying the show, please, whatever platform you're listening on, please leave me a review and a rating. It just helps other people find the show. I'd really appreciate it. So I hope this was really helpful, friends, and I will see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real, Brave, and Unstoppable. If you'd like to learn more about creating an authentic life that's true to who you are, visit CourtneyRivard.com/lovelife to download your free guide on how to build your vision and create a life that you love. You'll be so glad you did. I'll see you next time.